This is the time when the gods descended from heaven and Cohen.
Hair like wool lit by white fire, eyes burning like flame, a face brighter than 1,000 suns. That is a direct description of Jesus, written in a language most Westerners have never heard, preserved in a Bible most Christians have never opened, and guarded for 1,600 years inside a remote monastery on a mountain in northern Ethiopia. When Mel Gibson sat down with Joe Rogan and started talking about what he had found inside the Ethiopian canon, the studio went quiet. What he described did not match the Jesus most of us were raised on. And the strangest part is that the manuscripts backing him up are older than almost every Bible sitting in a Western church today. Mel Gibson is not a theologian. He is, however, the man who directed The Passion of the Christ, a film that earned more than $600 million at the global box office and was, at the time, the highest-grossing independent film in history. To make it, he hired Aramaic and Latin language consultants, brought in Jesuit advisors, and spent years reading texts most filmmakers would not even know exist. He has spoken openly, in multiple interviews stretching back to 2004, about studying early Christian writings outside the standard Western canon. Reportedly, his upcoming sequel, The Resurrection of the Christ, drove him deeper into a body of literature that Roman Catholics and Protestants quietly set aside more than 1,000 years ago, but that one church on the Horn of Africa never let go of. That church is the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and its scripture is the most expansive Christian Bible on earth. According to the church itself, the canon contains 81 books, with some scholars and Ethiopian editions counting as many as 88, depending on how a few grouped writings are divided. Compare that to the 66 books in a Protestant Bible or the 73% in a Catholic Bible. The difference is not a handful of footnotes. It is roughly 22 additional books that most Christians have never read, never been taught, or even heard quoted from a pulpit, and those manuscripts are not late forgeries. The Garima Gospels, housed at the Abba Garima Monastery in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, were radiocarbon dated by an Oxford laboratory between 2010 and 2013. The earlier of the two, known as Garima II, returned a date range of roughly 390 to 570% of the Common Era. That makes it the earliest surviving complete illuminated Christian manuscript anywhere in the world. Older than the Book of Kells, older than nearly every Greek and Latin Gospel codex in any European library, and it has been sitting in a wooden chest on a mountainside accessible only to monks for over 1,000 years. The official version of how the Christian Bible came together is the version most of us learned in Sunday school or in a college survey course. The early church fathers, sometime between the 2nd and 4th centuries, sorted through dozens of competing texts. They affirmed 4 Gospels, the letters of Paul, the Acts of the Apostles, and a small collection of other writings. By the time of the councils at Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397, the New Testament canon was effectively settled. The Old Testament, drawn largely from the Hebrew Scriptures, was finalized in similar fashion. The result was a tidy, closed library of inspired books. Case closed, on paper. Except the church in Ethiopia never agreed to that closure. While Rome and Constantinople were trimming the canon down, Ethiopian Christians, who had received the faith in the 4th century during the reign of King Ezana of Aksum, were doing the opposite. They kept the Book of Enoch. They kept the Book of Jubilees. They kept 3 books called Meqabyan, which are entirely different from the Maccabees in Catholic Bibles despite the similar name. They kept 4 Baruch, the letter of Jeremiah, the Ascension of Isaiah, Joseph, and Asenath, and a longer version of Ezra known as Ezra Sutuel. Texts that the rest of Christendom either rejected, lost, or quietly buried were preserved in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language related to Hebrew and Aramaic, and copied by hand by monks in candlelit cells generation after generation. The Book of Enoch is where the cracks in the official story become impossible to ignore. For nearly 1,500 years, Western scholars believed Enoch was lost. They had references to it. The New Testament book of Jude in verses 14 and 15 quotes Enoch directly, attributing the prophecy to Enoch, the 7th from Adam. Early church fathers like Tertullian, writing around the year 200, treated Enoch as scripture. And then, somewhere between the 4th and 9th centuries, the book vanished from European Bibles. It did not vanish from Ethiopian ones. In 1773, the Scottish explorer James Bruce traveled to Ethiopia and returned to Europe with 3 complete copies of the Book of Enoch, written in Ge'ez. Until that moment, scholars in Oxford and Paris genuinely did not believe a complete copy still existed anywhere on Earth. What Enoch describes is not the Jesus of a stained glass window. It describes a cosmic figure called the Son of Man, seated on a throne of glory, judging not only humans but fallen angels called the Watchers. These Watchers, according to chapters 6 through 16 of 1 Enoch, descended to earth, took human wives, taught forbidden knowledge, and fathered a race of giants called the Nephilim, the same word used in Genesis chapter 6. The text names them: Shemiaza, the leader; Azazel, who taught humanity weapons of war and the art of cosmetics; Baruch, who taught astrology. The level of specificity is unsettling, and when the Son of Man arrives in the later chapters of Enoch, he does not come merely to forgive sins. He comes to bind the Watchers in chains of darkness until the day of judgment. The Jesus of the Ethiopian tradition is therefore not just a teacher from Galilee, he is a judge of cosmic rebels older than humanity itself. This is what Gibson reportedly latched onto. In his conversations on the Joe Rogan Experience, he described wanting to portray Christ moving through other realms, watching angels fall, descending into hell, confronting beings that the Western imagination forgot how to picture. That is not invention. That descent into the underworld is described in detail in another text the Ethiopian Church preserves, the Ascension of Isaiah, which depicts Christ traveling down through 7 heavens, slipping past hostile spiritual powers in disguise before rising again. Western Christianity reduced this to a single line in the Apostles' Creed: he descended into hell. Ethiopian Christianity kept the whole travelogue. If you have made it this far and none of this sounds familiar, that is exactly the point. This channel exists for buried history that most documentaries will not touch. Hit subscribe right now, because what comes in the next few minutes is the part that made even Gibson lower his voice on the podcast. The Book of Jubilees is the next layer, and it rewrites the timeline of Genesis itself. Sometimes called the Little Genesis, Jubilees retells the stories from Adam through Moses, but it adds names, dates, and explanations the Standard Bible does not include. It names the wives of Cain and Seth. It identifies the angels who instructed Adam in agriculture. It describes a 364-day solar calendar that the Qumran community, the same community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, appears to have followed. And here's the detail that historians cannot easily wave away. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were unearthed in caves near Khirbet Qumran beginning in 1947, archaeologists found fragments of Jubilees in Hebrew dating to the 2nd century before Christ. They also found fragments of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic from roughly the same period. Both books, dismissed for centuries by the Western Church as late or non-canonical, were sitting in clay jars next to fragments of Genesis, Isaiah, and the Psalms, treated by the people who hid them as scripture worth dying to preserve. The conclusion is hard to escape. The Jewish community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, contemporaneous with Jesus and his earliest disciples, considered Enoch and Jubilees to be sacred. Jude in the New Testament quotes Enoch as prophecy. The Ethiopian Church, isolated from Roman politics by geography and language, simply preserved what the rest of Christendom let slip away. That is the official version turned inside out. The so-called extra books were not added in Ethiopia. They were subtracted everywhere else. There are details in these texts that, once you see them, you cannot unsee. In 1 Enoch chapter 46, the prophet describes a vision of the head of days, an ancient figure whose hair is white like wool, and beside him another figure whose face is like the appearance of a man. That second figure is the one Enoch is told will judge the kings of the earth. Compare that to the Book of Revelation, chapter 1, verses 13 through 16, written by John on the island of Patmos around the year 95% of the Common Era. John describes the risen Christ with hair white like wool, white as snow, eyes like a flame of fire, and a face like the sun shining in full strength. The imagery is not similar, it is nearly identical. John, writing the final book of the New Testament, appears to be drawing directly from a vision recorded in a book that most modern Christians have been told is not part of the Bible. The Ascension of Isaiah, preserved in full only in the Ethiopian canon, goes further. It describes Christ secretly entering the world, hidden from the rulers of the lower heavens, born so quietly that even the angels who governed those realms did not recognize him until he was already among them. Scholars at institutions like the University of Cambridge and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem have studied this text for decades. They date its core composition to the late 1st or early 2nd century, which makes it roughly contemporaneous with the canonical Gospels themselves. It is not a medieval invention. It is a window into how some of the earliest Christians actually pictured the Incarnation, and that picture is far stranger than the manger scene on a Christmas card. Then there is the question of physical description. The Ethiopian tradition, drawing on these older texts and on its own iconographic memory, has always depicted Jesus with darker skin and tightly curled hair. That is not an artistic flourish. It is consistent with a first-century Galilean Jewish man, and it lines up with the description in Revelation of hair like wool, a phrase that in the original Greek, erioluku, refers to the texture of unspun sheep's wool, not its color. The whiteness in the verse comes from a separate comparison to snow. Western art, beginning largely in the Italian Renaissance, gave the world a fair-skinned, long straight-haired Jesus painted in the image of European nobility. The Ethiopian tradition never made that swap. This is, reportedly, what Gibson kept circling back to. Not a conspiracy in the cartoon sense, with secret meetings and burned documents. Something subtler, a long, slow process of cultural editing, in which one tradition kept everything and another tradition curated heavily, and most of the world inherited the curated version without ever being told there was an alternative. He has said, in interviews around the production of the Resurrection of the Christ, that he wants the sequel to draw on imagery and theology that mainstream audiences have never been exposed to. That is the Ethiopian source material, almost certainly, even when he does not name it directly. The monastery itself is part of the story. Abba Garima Monastery sits on a high plateau in the Tigray region, founded according to tradition in the 6th century by one of the so-called 9 saints, monks who fled persecution in the Byzantine Empire and settled in the Aksumite kingdom. For centuries, women were forbidden from approaching the site. Outsiders, until very recently, were not permitted to photograph or even handle the manuscripts. The Ge'ez language itself, like Latin in the medieval West, became a sacred tongue understood only by the priesthood and a small educated class. When British art historian Jacques Mercier was finally allowed to send samples for radiocarbon dating in the early 2000s, the results stunned the academic world. The monks had been telling the truth about the age of their books all along. That kind of preservation does not happen by accident. It happens because a community decides, generation after generation, that something is worth protecting from the political and theological winds blowing through the rest of the world. While European libraries burned during invasions, plagues, and reformations, the monks of Abba Garima copied, recopied, and hid their codices in stone-walled rooms that even local authorities sometimes did not know existed. The Tigray War, which broke out in November 2020 and lasted into 2022, brought renewed fears for the manuscripts. Reports from Ethiopian church officials, cited in international press coverage from outlets like the BBC and the Art newspaper, described monks moving the most valuable codices into hiding as fighting approached the region. The exact details of where they were taken have never been fully disclosed. They are, as of the most recent verified reporting, safe. But the world came uncomfortably close to losing the oldest illuminated gospel book on earth in a 21st century war that most of the world barely paid attention to. So what does all of this actually change about the figure of Jesus? That is the question Gibson was reportedly wrestling with, and it is the question every viewer has to wrestle with on their own. The Ethiopian Bible does not deny anything in the 4 canonical Gospels. The Garima manuscripts contain Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in Ge'ez translation, with the same core narrative every Christian tradition recognizes. What the Ethiopian canon adds is context, a wider cosmic backdrop, a Christ who is not only the gentle teacher of the Sermon on the Mount, but the Son of Man of Enoch's vision, the descending judge of the Ascension of Isaiah, the figure standing at the center of a story that begins long before Bethlehem and extends into realms the Standard Bible only hints at. Whether that picture is true is a question of faith. Whether it was once part of the mainstream Christian imagination is a question of history, and the historical evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls to Jude's quotation of Enoch to the radiocarbon dating of Garima II is harder to dismiss than most people realize. For roughly the first 3 centuries of the Church, books like Enoch and Jubilees were read, debated, and cited by serious theologians. The decision to set them aside in the West was made by specific councils in specific cities for specific political and theological reasons. It was not handed down from heaven, it was a human editorial choice, and in one corner of Africa, that choice was simply never made. Gibson, for all his fame and all his controversy, is not the first person to point at this material and ask why most of us have never been allowed to see it. Scholars like James Vanderkam at the University of Notre Dame, George Nickelsburg at the University of Iowa, and Lauren Stuckenbrook at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich have spent entire careers translating, annotating, and publishing critical editions of Enoch and Jubilees. Their books are dense, expensive, and largely confined to seminary libraries. What Gibson did, on a podcast watched by tens of millions, was drag a conversation that had been happening in academic footnotes into a global living room. Whatever you think of him personally, that act of translation from the academy to the public is why so many people are now searching the phrase Ethiopian Bible for the first time in their lives. The unanswered question is the one Gibson himself reportedly keeps coming back to, and it is the one worth leaving with you. If the earliest illuminated gospel book on earth was made in Ethiopia, and if the Christian Bible used by that same Ethiopian church contains roughly 20 more books than the one most of us grew up reading, what exactly was lost when those books were left out, and who decided that we did not need them? Drop your honest answer in the comments. Tell us whether you had ever heard of the Garima Gospels before today, whether the Book of Enoch was ever mentioned in your church, and what you think Gibson is really chasing in his next film. If buried history, suppressed manuscripts, and the parts of the story no one taught you in school are the kind of thing you want to keep digging into, subscribe to the channel. There is a great deal more where this came from, and the deeper we go, the stranger it gets.